Hello. Thank you very much for taking time to join us today as we go on with this extended celebration of World Standards Day and look at how standards, international standards, are supporting with progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. As we start off, I think it's useful to see where you all are participating from. So thank you very much for taking time again, and ni hao, konnichiwa, xin chào, namaste, salam, guten morgen, bonjour. Thanks a lot. Also useful to see is that on one hand, we have factories, manufacturers, brands, but we also have NGOs, consultants, third-party service providers, and researchers together with representatives from the government. So all stakeholders who are normally involved with standards development. And useful to know which industry segments you represent. So we have participants representing textile industry, the electronics industry, automotive, machinery, food, furniture, but also services. Now, as we move ahead and listen from our experts today, it was useful for us to understand from you, what are you feeling? Do you see any roadblocks? Do you see any barriers in terms of mainstreaming sustainability standards? And this is what you all provided as feedback. A quarter of you mentioned that there aren't enough relevant international standards to link to sustainability aspects. A quarter of you also mentioned that while there are standards, there's still a lack of harmonizations amongst them between the standards from the different countries. And then a quarter of you mentioned that there's this incomplete mapping of which technical product service standards are linked to which broader, let's say, ESG metrics. But also useful to see that some of you felt that greenwashing is coming in the way of earning that trust of consumers, whether this be final consumers or these be B2B customers of ours. And we see that some of you feel that there's a significant cost associated with implementation of these standards. And there's also, in some cases, lack of binding regulations on country level. So what we are talking about are standards. Perhaps this is the one common thread that binds us all. This is that one common language that connects us all, whether we use our computers and they are connected to the internet, or we purchase food and we weigh them. All of that is thanks to common standards that all of us globally agree to abide by. And I think it's important to know why we are having this talk today, why we are here, why we have these great minds together, and why many of you are in here. So the last many decades has, of course, meant that as humankind, we are developing, we are growing. Also, as the economic output of the world is growing, it's putting a particular burden on our world, in terms of demand for food, in terms of demand for resources. And all of that pressure is not being balanced well. And so hence, we have these commitments for climate goals, commitments for sustainable development goals. And to go along that path, of course, we need some guarding rails, we need some rules, we need a map, we need tools to help us understand. Many of these started off developing already in the previous century. We had the Common Future, we had the Framework Convention set up, we had the UN Global Compact that brought together businesses to also contribute and support. But we also had international standards like the ISO 26000. We'll be hearing about that from Mr. Hans Kroda later. And then came, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate targets that many of the countries, or most of the countries, adopted, and many of the businesses also took it upon themselves to align their operations, their products, their services. When we see in case of one such region, the European Union, they also have a mapping of which of their policies, their overarching policies, whether it be their climate and energy package or their health program, how each one of these is supporting, enabling the individual SDGs. On the same time, we see organizations like the UNFCCC showcasing the mapping between the conventions and these individual SDGs. So with all of that, we come to where are we today? So that's the scorecard of each of our countries in terms of performance with the so-called SDGs. So you see the darker shade countries have a score greater than 80. And then you see the next set is 70 to 80, 60 to 70. It will be interesting to have your feedback either via chat or via Q&A as to what do you feel? Do you get a feeling when your country has that particular shade? Do you as an individual and does your company or industry also feel that there's progress being made along those SDGs, especially as it relates to you? So if you feel comfortable, please share your feedback either via chat or Q&A. And before we move ahead, yeah, it's important that while we say standards, I mean, to look at it on a simple perspective, many of us are using mobile phones. We are using transportation mechanisms, whether it be a vehicle or a bicycle or so on, or we are walking and we are measuring how much distance we are walking. We are having consumer products in our lives. We are consuming services. All of those are reliant on certain standards, sometimes international, sometimes regional. And what we will be focusing upon today is which of these standards today are there to support, enable, and let's say push further progress towards SDGs, and thereby helping each of us, each of our industries and countries. And with SDGs, we are talking about these so-called 17 UN SDGs, which is, let's say, the dialogue, the communication mechanism that is being used today in terms of sustainability. And while we see them as individual blocks, it's evident, of course, that progress on any one SDG has an impact on the others. There are already standards on the aspect of social labor, chemical management, water efficiency, raw material efficiency, and so on. And each activity, each indicator links to many other indicators of many other SDGs. And we look at a little bit further into how standardization organization also put this into perspective and connect and interlink the existing standards that are there. So to start off, I think it's important to know how these standards are developed in a manner which are inclusive, in a manner which such that these standards consider what NGOs have in mind, what technical experts have in mind for the greater good of humanity. And for that, let's start off hearing from Ms. Pamela Tarif. She's with ECOS, whereby she brings together stakeholders, which are NGOs, technical experts, standardization body, but also regional and international policymakers. Prior to ECOS, Pamela was with the National Standardization Body in Australia, prior to which she was with ISO based in Geneva and also served some time at ITU. So Pamela, I think you are a true diplomat, yeah? I'm sure you have a lot of experience bringing together different minds and trying to harmonize and develop this consensus, but also to make sure that all these perspectives of the stakeholders are taken into consideration. So if you could please share with us how ECOS and your team is involved in this aspect and take us through this journey of how all the many years that you have spent, if you can compress it in about 15 minutes for us, yeah?
Thank you very much, Rakesh, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Let me just open my screen here. I hope you can now see the full screen of my slides. So thank you for that lovely introduction, Rakesh. And indeed, I'm here to tell you a bit about the organization I now work for, which is ECOS, the Environmental Coalition on Standards. And as you can see there in our first slide, our role is to promote environmentally friendly technical standards that support policies and laws. So my role is as head of global engagement is to see greater participation in this work, and we'll discuss some aspects of that as we go through the slides. So perhaps many of you will not have heard yet about ECOS. We're an international environmental non-governmental organization. We're based in Belgium, in Brussels. And in our secretariat, we are a core of technical expertise that cover some of the subjects that I'll be mentioning further in the presentation. We also have a network of members. We currently are over 50. Many of those members are based in Europe, but that's something we want to grow and change and expand. And we have a global network of experts, technical experts, that support us when we get into the real details of the standards that we're involved in. We rely on technical experts as well. And of course, we partner with many of the other organizations that are speaking here today. So it's great to be on board with the other panel members. What is our mission in ECOS? Well, standards are really central to the work that we do. So we want to see high quality standards developed. We want the kind of standards that can benefit the environment, can benefit society, and also business. And we also want to see the environmental voice well represented in the standards development process, whether that's national standards, regional standards, or international level. It's really important that the international, that the environmental perspective is present when the standards are being developed. And that's crucial when we want to make sure that those standards do enable, as Rakesh was introducing earlier, that they enable delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals and that they produce environmentally friendly technologies. And we're not suggesting that standards replace legislation, but rather that standards support legislation. And in developing that legislation, they're fit for purpose. So here, as I say, standardization is a core aspect of the work that we do in ECOS, but we also think about the policy issues that underpin that work. So we bring that expert eye to some of the topics that we want to see new standards developed or stronger standardization. So we make sure that we understand the subject areas. Oops. We make sure that we understand the subject areas, and in some cases we advocate for those, sometimes running campaigns. But the focus is always to bring that angle into the development of the standards and ensure a strong environmental voice. So many of you may be wondering, but how exactly do standards support environmental protection? Well, one of the key ways is through the innovation and technological developments of new products. So we see industry competitiveness help foster that aspect of standardization. And we encourage, while companies are innovating around new products, we want to see greater reflection of the possibility to build in that environmental protection. We also see opportunities for environmental performance and energy savings in the development of new products that our consumers are then faced with choosing in the marketplace. And we want to support consumers as they make those decisions through effective labeling and other information that allows them to select more environmentally friendly products over others. But to do that, of course, we need to see tools that support the measurements, the comparability, verifiability, and reliability. So it's another area where we focus in and support standards. Some of you may not have come up against the role that standards play in public policy and legislation. So I included this slide here just to clarify how that works. So you'll see at the top there of this little graphic that policy, we regard policy as being there to define overall objectives. And any legislation and laws will feed into those policies by defining what the essential requirements are. So, but they'll indicate the what without really specifying the how. And this is where standards play a key role. Standards are setting out the technical specifications that can meet those regulatory or policy requirements. So there's a really important role there where standards feed into public policy and legislation. I want to switch over now to highlight some of the areas of work that ECOS focuses in on. And there are three main pillars here that I'm going to describe for you today. And hopefully some of these topics are meaningful for those of you tuning in today. So decarbonizing key sectors. We've all followed the developments, of course, in COP26. And for ECOS, some of these areas are extremely important. So sustainable buildings, for example. Some of us live in cold countries, some of us live in hot countries, and we all understand the importance of heating and cooling. Now, improving the effectiveness of those kinds of tools is a central part of our work. We look at smart homes and buildings. We want to improve the energy performance of buildings. But we also look at cleaner energy. And again, we hear much discussion about coal and gas and new technologies such as hydrogen and bioenergy. So again, we're looking at the possibilities for standardization around those subjects. We also look at product circularity and eco-design. And I don't know if you're all familiar with those labels. But the idea is that designers and manufacturers think about the circularity of their product as they design them. And so it builds into any new products the fact that a product has a cycle, a life cycle, and to anticipate what will happen to those products as they move through the life cycle. So plastic bottles, household appliances, textiles, electronics, batteries, automotive, construction products, and so on are all areas of manufacturing where there are opportunities to consider how we can redesign in anticipation of a circular economy. Looking also at some of the tools I mentioned before, that we need to be able to measure how we're doing in terms of the circular economy and material efficiency, and we need standards to support that work. So we look at things like repairability scores, environmental management and life cycle assessment, measuring environmental health. And as Rakesh set out at the beginning, green claims is another area that we need to consider. So where do we do this work? Well, ECOS is involved in the standardization system at all levels. The international level, many of you will have heard of ISO and IEC. These are two major international standards development bodies, and Hans will be talking more about those later. So ECOS acts as a liaison organization to ISO and IEC, and perhaps in the future we'll want to do more with the ITU as well. And we observe and support some of the work that goes on in ISO and IEC in some of their environmental bodies that are mentioned there on the slides. But we also have members, our national members, who look and increasingly look to participate through national standards bodies. And you may know that national standards bodies are very central to the work that we do in the standardization system because they are the gateways. National standards bodies are the gateways to international standards and to regional standardization as well as national standards. So they play a very crucial role. And we do have a question, I think, in the poll that Ryan might be putting up in a moment, where we'll be asking you about your participation. Here we are, whether you have ever taken part in the development of a standard. And I'm curious to know whether that's something any of you have had the opportunity to be involved in, perhaps through your national standards body. So whenever you have the chance to vote on that question, that would be interesting for our discussions later. So continuing with the slide, we also in ECOS take part in regional standardization, and particularly historically that's been at the European level, where we are what's called an Annex 3 organization, which gives a special status as a civil society player to take part in the work of CEN and CENELEC. Okay, so that's an interesting split, about 40-60 on the question. So great, that's really helpful to know. Thank you for that feedback. And just finishing off on this message that we participate in regional standardization through CEN and CENELEC and ETSI, which are the three equivalent bodies in the European context. And just try and move on. I seem to have, there we are. So I wanted to, having listened to some of the feedback you've given to Rakesh in the survey, I wanted just to highlight some of the work that ECOS is doing in those areas that may be of interest to some of you who are tuning in today. And I wanted to show how the work of ECOS focuses in on the kind of policy demands and advocacy work that we do, and how that then translates into the standards. So you can see hopefully on your screens some of the policy areas where we see the opportunities for better use of textiles, better development of textiles. So for example, make the products reusable and repairable and recyclable, limit the microplastic release from textiles, focus on toxic-free materials, promote raw materials that are sustainably sourced. So these are all the kind of issues that underpin our work. And if you're interested, you can also read the report that's mentioned there on the screen, the Durable, Repairable and Mainstream, which focuses in on some of those questions in more detail. And if we share these slides later, you'll have the link directly. So we think about the subjects in these contexts, and then we try to take them forward into the work that is going on in standards development. So you'll see this, I've simply pulled out one example of textiles, and I won't pretend to understand what hydrolysis and biodegradation and hydroxylate is, but the point here really is to show that in looking at the challenges and the policy issues and some of the legislation requirements, we can then focus in on the standards that are being developed to make sure that they reflect some of these requirements. And likewise, another example I saw in the survey that the automotive industry may be interesting for our audience today. So again, looking at vehicles, so repairability, how we can dismantle vehicles, how we can reuse parts within those vehicles, how we can trace the product passport and so on. So taking those challenges and bringing them into standards development. Here's an example, another standard, it's actually a workshop agreement from 2017, which looks at the sustainable management of secondary materials. So these standards or guidelines exist, these are best practices agreed at international level that can support some of these challenges that all of us are facing in our countries. Another example just to highlight is circular electronics and e-waste. We're all very familiar now with the kind of waste that piles up in computers. We understand the precious metals that are lost within those products, and some of them can be radioactive and quite detrimental to our environment, and also to human health as well, because there are heavy metals that feature in some of those equipments that leach out into the environment. So again, there are opportunities there to standardize the products, to standardize the reuse of those products. And again, I've highlighted, interestingly, an older example of cooperation between the International Electrotechnical Commission and a standard that they produced as far back as '95, using symbols that have been developed in the International Organization for Standardization in terms of recycling. And then greenwashing, again, was another subject that came up in the survey. And I wanted to highlight this report that ECOS did, I think it was last year, highlighting some of the green claims on plastic products. And again, I invite you to have a closer read of that report. But you can see here that some of the highlights I pulled out here. So certainly we analysed something like 80 products, plastics products. Around 50% is, interestingly, 50% of the claims were misleading. Only 8 of those products fulfilled all of the claimed criteria. The second column there, the product with the greatest number of vagus claims, diapers or nappies, you may call them, and wet wipes were one of the highlights there, lots of misleading claims, and also plastic bottles. So again, I invite you to have a little read of that report if that's useful for you. And I wanted to come back in the context of the question that was asked in the poll, and to think about standards and where standards come from and who's involved in the development of standards. And I wanted to highlight that standards are supposed to be developed in a consultative, open, consensus-based operation and system, and that all of us have the opportunity to feed into the development of standards. It's not something that happens over there. There are challenges, of course, to being involved. There are costs to being involved. But my point was to make that the standardization system needs experts. It needs those who have an understanding of the products that we're talking about. And in ECOS, for example, we are looking for new members. We're looking to expand our membership. And we're also looking to grow our expertise. This is a current call for experts where we're looking, for example, in material efficiency of furniture and also hydrogen that we mentioned earlier. So certainly there's an opportunity to come on board and get involved and share your knowledge and help us make this kind of standards that can help improve our environment and improve our world. So thank you all very much for listening. It's a very quick and high level overview of the work we do, but I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel presentations and to your questions as we move into the discussions. Thank you, Rakesh.
Thank you very much, Pam. I know it's a challenge to compress the work that so many of your colleagues are doing, but thank you for giving us a glimpse. Now, we heard about getting all these stakeholders together, getting together all of these interests. And there's one organization which has to then balance the interests and develop that consensus. And I think I don't have to tell you how difficult or challenging a task that is. So we'll hear from Mr. Hans Kroder, who was directly involved in the development of two global international standards, the ISO 26000 standard for social responsibility and the ISO 20400 for sustainable procurement, which, as many of you would know, are practical tools of implementing the 2030 agenda. Mr. Kroder is still the vice chair of this global engagement network for the ISO 26000. He's also involved in the ISO group, which is working on circularity. And very importantly, he's also convening the group, the ad hoc group, which is about measuring circularity, which is what Pam also hinted at. So, Mr. Kroder, if you too could somehow compress the many decades of work, the involvement of over 100 members and thousands of experts, and take us through this short journey on how ISO has established standards and it continues to link to different aspects of SDGs. Yeah? Over to you then.
You can see the PowerPoint, Rakesh?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here in this interesting seminar. Good morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening. I'm happy to share some of the information which ISO is working on globally on sustainability and how these standards can contribute to the SDGs. When we have had COP26 in Glasgow the past weeks, there was also the Secretary General from the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, who said that standards need to achieve net zero. That means that many standards need to be very ambitious in helping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And maybe even some standards which are focusing on a linear economy need to be transformed to a better focus on a circular economy. So there's a lot of work to be done also in the near future for global standards. And looking at the ISO system, like Pamela already explained, that ISO has member bodies, national member bodies in each country, and they play a central role. And they are the gateways for their country to the international standards and also to regional standards. And for example, ABNT in Brazil, GISC in Japan, RSB in Rwanda, NEN in the Netherlands. So there are more than 165 NSBs who are being the gateway to all these standards, and lots of these standards are sustainability standards. And the writing of these standards, let me get the laser pointer, will be a multi-stakeholder development with experts from industries, governments, NGOs, labor organizations, consumers, academics, and also consultancy. So this multi-stakeholder development is key to have a good consensus and to have a good adoption level of these standards. And examples, very well-known examples are 9001, 14001 on environmental management, and 26,000 on social responsibility. When we look at the impact of the ISO standards on the Sustainable Development Goals, well, first of all, ISO standards contributes to all the SDGs. And you see per SDG, you see a number of standards that directly or indirectly or partly contribute to the SDGs. So there are a lot of standards contributing to each of the SDGs. And if you want to have more specific knowledge about a specific SDG and which standards are contributing, there is a search tool on the ISO website, and you can then find standards who are related to these Sustainable Development Goal. So I think this is very helpful if you are trying to find information, and there's of course so many standards. This tool will help you to find the appropriate standards. And I would like to ask you a question, because one of the roadblocks that were mentioned is that there's a lack of sufficient and relevant international sustainability standards. Just wait. And my question is, what is the rationale behind this roadblock? Is it difficult to find these standards? Or maybe there are too much standards, regional and local, that you don't have any overview again? Or are there other reasons? So please fill in the poll question, and maybe we can use this for further dialogue. Okay, I will go on with the next slide. Too much, I see, okay, I see too much regional and local standards. Yeah, that's one of the things which I've noticed in real practice. Therefore, especially for small and medium enterprises, it's sometimes very difficult. So many standards, they don't have a specific staff department who can analyze all these standards. Okay, thank you. Difficult to find. So with that, well, there we have the ISO search tool. What about the sustainability puzzle or the social responsibility puzzle? Well, on top of this puzzle, we have the UN agenda, of course. And then the next part of the layer is we have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the UNGP. We have the UN ILO conventions and recommendations for the labor rights. And we have, for the OECD countries, we have the responsible business conduct and guidelines for multinational enterprises. Well, that doesn't mean that it has to be large companies. This is also applicable for the small and medium-sized companies. When we look at the holistic frameworks which are there to support sustainability, then we have 26,000, 2,400 sustainable procurement, and from the United Nations we have the life cycle initiatives with the environmental and social life cycle assessment. These are umbrella frameworks which will also help you not only to provide more detail on what is sustainable, what are sustainable issues, but also how to implement them. And that's, of course, with the international norms of behavior and the OECD guidelines, they only tell you what to do, but they don't tell you how to implement it. So, and that's where the ISO frameworks are coming. And these are integrated holistic frameworks. And then of course we can go one layer more into depth. And then there are a lot of ISO standards which will help you, for example, on the environmental part, the ISO 14000 series. There's also life cycle assessment in greenhouse gas emissions. Then, for example, 45001 on the labor rights and health and safety, 50001 on energy management, and the new 59000 series, which is coming up on the circular economy. And OECD has also drafted a guidance standard on due diligence, which is top of the bill, top of the world, which is really very, very helpful in looking into your supply chain and addressing negative impacts and how to mitigate these negative effects and how to avoid this. So this really sustainability standards on the how to do, on the how to implement this. And then we have two frameworks on the reporting part, which are global and really the GRI framework on Global Reporting Initiative is really the best in the world. It's for more than 25 years already focusing on a holistic approach. It's fully aligned to the SDGs. It's fully aligned to 26,000. It also has sector supplements, for example, for the automotive and mining and financial industry. So these are frameworks which are helping you to find your way through all these standards. Looking at the 26,000 social responsibility, or you can also call it sustainability, it has a focus on 7 core subjects. And you see organizational governance in the center, in the heart, because good governance or bad governance is influencing your policy on human rights, on labor practices, on fair operating practices, consumer issues, the environment, and contribution to the development and to the society. This is the only global standard on social responsibility or corporate social responsibility or sustainability, no matter how you want to call it. And it's developed by 99 countries and 42 liaison partners with all the important organizations in the world. It took 4 years preparations and 6 years development. It was the fully multi-stakeholder development, and it was also aligned between developing countries and developed countries. There were even more developing countries participating than developed countries. And it has been adopted as national standard in more than 88 countries, adopted as a European standard since October 2020, and it has been translated into more than 30 languages. This is really the overarching umbrella when we talk about sustainability and contributing to the SDGs. And there are brochures for free, which you can download on the ISO website. And they are really very helpful. They're really very helpful how to make the connection between standards and the contribution to the SDGs. Looking at the framework essentials of 26,000, you see also an ethical part. You see norms and values. They're called the social responsibility principles. So accountability, for example, is the #1 principle of social responsibility. So that means that decision makers and CEOs, they should be accountable for their decisions and for all the activities of their organization. And you see transparency, ethical behavior, and then respect for stakeholder interests through the rule of law. And where rule of law is not strong enough, there we have the international norms of behavior and respect for human rights. And here are the 7 core subjects, and they are all being divided in many issues, 37 issues in total. So this is a complete umbrella on sustainability. And then there are 2 fundamental practices that you are not alone on the globe. You are operating in a chain or a value chain, or you can have influence, and you have stakeholders, internal and external, and you have to integrate it throughout your operation and throughout your relationships in the value chain. But this is a very holistic approach of sustainability, which is helping you in contributing to the SDGs. And like Rakesh said, I'm also vice chair of a global stakeholders network on ISO 26000. And we are still advocating and promoting this ISO 26000 standard. So if you are interested, please join our network. It's for free. Follow-up standard on ISO 26000 for the supply chain is 2400. And this is also a leverage for the global goals. So this is very helpful to also apply together in collaboration with your suppliers. And you can profit from the Dutch ISO member body, NEN, together with the Dutch Procurement Association, Navy, because they have developed a free web tool. I was involved in the development of this tool. You can see here the link, web tool ISO 2400.nl/en, en from English. So it's an English language tool with 60 questions. And it will help you to look at your procurement and how you can integrate sustainability into your procurement. And it will help you in your dialogue with your suppliers. And this is really a very, very helpful tool, and it's for free. So everyone is invited to have a look at this tool. And this is the practical part. And this is the practical part of the ISO standards, where there is an additional tooling being made available by a national standard body. So there's also tools which are coming available via consultancy firms. And this is a consultancy from Germany together with India, who developed an SDG Voyager, which really explains into detail how the ISO 26000 and 2400 are contributing to all the different SDG goals and targets. So this is also then a tooling which is available for free. Looking at goal 12, and Pamela from ICAS already showed us a lot of challenges which we have on SDG 12, because we need 3 planets in 2050 if we do nothing. So there's really an urge to take up the circular economy. And ISO is developing at the moment 5 circular economy standards. As you can see, there is the first standard 5904, a general framework for implementation and providing information on principles and definitions. Then 59010 is a standard which is focusing on business models and value networks and how you can transform your business model and which circularity strategies you can choose. 59020, where I'm global chair, measuring and assessing circularity, and then another standard which is more focusing on the product part. So it's a product circularity data sheet which will standardize the dialogue within value chains and across value chains about circularity data that is needed. And there's also a standard on secondary materials. That's going further on. Pamela, you showed the International Workshop Agreement, and this is going more into a real ISO standard. And as you can see, SDG 9 and 12 are central, but they are, when you work on circular economy, SDG 9 is also very important because buildings, infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc., they are really having a huge impact on the circular economy. But you can also contribute to many other SDGs if you start working on circular economy. Maybe, I don't know, Rakesh, is there still some time for Q&A, or do we need to go to
Yeah, we will have Q&A at the end, so
okay.
as the audience start putting. Thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks for your participation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for opening the window and allowing us to see what ISO is working on and also your personal stories on this. Now, having looked at all of those standards which ISO is developing, of course, many of these have to be then implemented by the countries. And many of these countries are taking up these voluntary standards and preparing schemes with regards to sustainability and developing this. To take us through this journey now, we'll have Ms. Siti Rubia Lambert, or Ruby. She's with the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards. She's an international expert there. She also works with APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, on the voluntary sustainability standards, especially focusing on developing countries. So Ruby, if you could please share with us how the VSS program is working in these countries and how they are taking this topic of standards and making it better and making it easier for SMEs than to participate.
Thank you very much, Rakesh. I hope you can see my screen. Unfortunately, I can't do the full screen because I still don't know how it works with the swapping of screens. So I hope this works. Thanks. So good day, everyone. It brings me really great pleasure to be participating in this dialogue, particularly in this time where the pandemic has rolled back the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And thank you also to the fellow panelists before me for all your very interesting presentations. Now, Ryan, I do have a poll question that I would like to put up at the beginning, if you don't mind. Exactly. So how much food are lost annually between harvest and retail? It's actually a trick question, you know. Do we have the results yet? Okay. Very interesting. Okay. So most of you say it's 30%. No, I know we have a smaller group of agriculture sector in this webinar. I saw it's all, I think it's below 5%, but food, when we talk about food, it's one topic that certainly speaks to all of us. So answering to this poll question, the FAO report found that around 14% of the world's food is lost after harvesting and even before reaching the retail shelves, including through on-farm activities, storage, and transportation. So I said, this is a trick question because if we were to consider also the after retail shelves, a third, or we can also refer to 30% of food was lost or wasted each year. So 14% out of this 30% total food loss due to poor production and handling techniques, not even at the consumption stage yet, is a lot and should be addressed. I believe this is why we are here today to discuss the role of standards and how standards can be harmonized as part of global governance. With that, let me first introduce the UNFSS. So it's actually United Nations Forum for Sustainability Standards. This is actually an initiative of 5 UN agencies. We have UNIDO, FAO, UNEP, ITC, and that UNCTAD, where I belong, coordinates this collaboration. And we're also very honored to have UNECE more and more today, represented by Ms. Turk, to be increasingly involved in this initiative as a means to leverage voluntary sustainability standards as a vehicle to achieve the SDGs. We are not ardent promoters of VSS per se, nor do we develop them, but we are aware that VSS is becoming more evident as a market reality today, and there are externalities that needs to be addressed and making it an enabling tool. So UNFSS aims to facilitate emerging economies and developing countries, especially significantly to access lucrative markets by leveraging this market demand tool. We stimulate well-informed dialogue among key stakeholders and build capacities for producers and SMEs to enhance their opportunities in international trade, and also to ensure that they do not fall vulnerable in the whole market dynamics. So before I go on, so what do we do? What are the 3 key things that we do in UNFSS is firstly through research and analysis with academic experts, especially through informed policy dialogues, and also to support our national multi-stakeholder platforms that are typically led by standards bodies in each country. So now we have more than 25 countries participating in the VSS national platforms and initiatives network. So before I go on further about scaling up sustainable consumption and production, allow me first to explicate VSS. So as you may already know, standards are typically voluntary by nature until it's been adopted in a in the regulatory framework. Sustainability standards are basically standards that specify requirements that producers, traders, manufacturers, retailers, or even service providers may be asked to meet relating to a wide range of sustainability metrics. So their characteristics is that they have the potential to be a seal of approval, an effective marketing tool. It sets premium price to help producers benchmark profit, for example, and also a tool for market access, especially for importing countries that have set sustainability measures as their de facto mandatory regulation. So I am saying this because the point of reference and uptake is very evident today. There are VSS and eco labels that exist today in the market, and that consumers today are also willing to pay premium for products that are sustainably produced because of the increased awareness about environmental damages and social issues in the production methods. Sometimes a product also needs to meet more than one standard in order to be accepted in the retail market. I think our previous speakers have also mentioned that, and this is the reality. Even the production value today has been relevant with sustainability measures, especially given that more sustainability provisions have been included in trade agreements today. So here's some data to show you how VSS have become a market reality. So as you can see here, the number of VSS have increased over the past, especially the past years. And that you can see that also the number of VSS is more prominent in the agricultural sector. Let me go to the next slide. Okay, so in a nutshell, in order to see the linkages of VSS in sustainable development, we have to consider it as a new regulatory form. So basically, VSS are market-based instruments. VSS are not a corporate code of conduct. Instead, major retailers and brand owners consider VSS as a marketing tool. With that, VSS market is rapidly growing. It is also regulated through information. So part of being market-based instrument is that it uses information such as the labeling, the certification to create market incentives for sustainable production and trade. It also follows a form of voluntary governance in the sense that VSS are typically set by private entities with a goal to meet economic, social, and environmental sustainability. It can also include some other metrics such as human rights, equitable profit sharing, decent working conditions, conservation of natural resources, biodiversity, etc. So here I would just like to point out the effects of VSS on sustainable development. We see that the direct impact can be depicted by the mapping exercise of VSS requirements directly to the SDG targets, which I will talk about in the next slide. But the direct mapping of VSS to the sustainable development alone is not enough to understand the net effect of VSS on trade costs. So the key takeaway here is that the indirect effect of VSS towards achieving the sustainable development is that it should also consider its effect on trade and economic growth. Only when this can be addressed, it has the potential to achieve sustainable development. So, so here I will just point out some of the, the direct effects of VSS to sustainable development. And this is based on the findings from our publication, which is called Linking Voluntary Standards to the SDGs. For this study, it requires a mapping of VSS requirements to the SDG targets. So based on 232 VSS available in the ITC Standards Map repository that we studied, there was a count of 800 requirements. And these requirements are in a form of indicators in order to be certified. So by mapping this against the 17 SDGs, which comprises of 169 targets, it was found that the interlinkages concluded with 508 VSS requirements, as you can see in the middle of the two circles. which are directly linked to 16 SDGs of 55 targets. Now, at the middle diagram, what you see is that the results we found is that the 3 SDGs that are most widely covered in the VSS studied for this particular publication is that SDG 8, which is decent work in economic growth, SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, as well as SDG 2, zero hunger, are the most widely covered. Now, if we were to zoom directly to SDG 12, which is the third diagram in this slide, so SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, what we see is that the requirements of VSS mainly address issues related to waste management. Also the use of chemicals, for example, organic fertilizers, and also how it part of the system is that it trains the staff on sustainability issues and the development of environmental and social management systems, among others. And what I like to highlight also is that according to the United Nations, SDG 12 can be achieved by educating consumers on sustainable consumption and lifestyle by providing them with adequate information through standards and labels and engaging in sustainable public procurement, among others. So by understanding that the activities in agricultural manufacturing often contributes to carbon emissions, and that the imbalanced market power often leaves smallholder farmers in poverty, VSS can be considered as vital tools to facilitate the global governance of this sector to be more sustainable. Now, what about the indirect effects of VSS to sustainable development? In the interest to understand the net effect of VSS in trade costs, we must address some of these questions. The first question is, who benefits? There are fundamental questions about whether broad-based implementation of VSS can bring a swath of producers out of extreme poverty. But to date, certification benefits have typically gone to larger, more organized producers in the regions and have more developed production capacities. And then the second question is the multiplicity and proliferation of VSS. The rise in the number of standards brought up questions related to the credibility of VSS, given that the range of claims and the confusions they create for producers and buyers and consumers as well. And then the third question is the question on applicability and feasibility of VSS. In local operating context, international VSS are sometimes perceived as too top-down in their norms, or too stringent regulations are not always universally applicable. So, and then the last and the most common question that has been raised is the cost. Certification procedure is very costly and it takes time. What we see is that getting adequate information about VSS is time, and time is cost. You know, so all of these challenges, as you can see, largely affects the smallholder producers and farmers, the SMEs. And if we were to leave to the retailers and the buyers to take control of the entire sustainability of their supply chain, this would lead to power imbalances, which means that producers or the small-scale producers will have to abide to any conditions set by the retailers in order for their products to be sold. So here's the bonus question. Are VSS trade enhancers or barriers to trade? So while we see that certification can expand demands and improve access to importing markets, shifting to sustainability improves productivity in the long run, and that economy have diverse platforms to integrate the multidimensional aspects of sustainability beyond just economic gains. However, the mainstreaming of VSS also means that producers and farmers and MSMEs especially will need to acquire heavy upfront costs, investments, which is actually already a huge burden for them in general. And then when you translate this into their cost price, this questions their competitive advantage of the product. And in many cases, this marginalizes SMEs who are already confronted with challenges to sell their goods. So in the work stream of the UNFSS, one third of the mandate which can be attributed to the need for standards institutionalization, i.e. Government intervention. Let us start with the problem. In developing countries, they don't always have the means to maximize the impact of VSS, as I have raised just before this on the socio-economic issues that arises when targeting sustainable development. And then at the same time, there are drivers also to consider from the consumers and risk management demands. So public authorities use trade as a means to implement sustainability, which have been very evident in many of the sustainability provisions that are reflected in trade agreements today. So with such view, national platforms or the multi-stakeholder initiatives that functions through basically the multi-stakeholder sort of approach play a crucial role in regulating this net effects of VSS in trade costs. So for example, getting adequate information is a cost and it eats into the operation time. So getting the right information and having the right infrastructural assistance can also help the small scale producers or SMEs or MSMEs tremendously. So just on this note, the UNFSS assists the national platforms through a multi-stakeholder approach. And this is typically demand-driven. And it works basically in the dynamics of making all the different parties to get involved in this dialogue. So the aim really is to foster knowledge exchange and also to link evidence-based studies to policy making. This is especially key to contribute to sustainable development. And as of today, we have assisted to establish demand-driven platforms in India, in Brazil, in China, and Mexico. And we also have continuous initiatives at the Caribbean states through CrossQ, the Andean community, and also in APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, as mentioned by Rakesh, and also through the ARSO, the African Organization for Standardization. So with that, I'm coming to the last slide. Allow me to conclude with some way forward. So firstly, I think it's important to enhance the regional and national capacity through the governance model that involves independent certification bodies to cope with the rising demand for standards, sustainability standards. And then secondly, to support for agri producers and farmers through social protection policies to improve productivity and access to markets. And thirdly, to harmonize and strengthen the coordination along supply chains and governance of the VSS. And lastly, last but not least, to enhance the regional sustainability competitiveness through collective efforts. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you. I hope I'm on time.
Thank you very much, Ruby. You mentioned the word trade 18 times. And I think now comes the important part. We heard from the perspective of an NGO who is bringing together experts to develop standards. We heard from an international standardization organization, ISO, about standards. We heard about voluntary sustainability standards and how they can support sustainable consumption and production. And I know many of you are thinking, yes, but what about us? We are an SME. How do we ensure that we don't have an issue with trade because these standards are different? How do we make sure that data about our products and raw material can transparently be linked to whichever foreign country it is in? And Ms. Elizabeth Turk, I think she's been patiently listening to all of the great ideas that we have and maybe also anticipating some of the challenges that you might be having in your mind. So please allow me to welcome Ms. Elizabeth Turk. She's the Director of Economic Cooperation and Trade Division at the UNECE and leads the division's work across 4 sections: cooperation and partnerships, innovative policies, market access, and trade facilitation. Prior to being with UNECE, Ms. Turk was involved with UNCTAD and was also involved with this joint UNCTAD OECD monitoring of G20's investment policy changes. So it will be very interesting to see how via UNECE, you bring together policymakers and you help ensure greater regulatory cooperation and standardization to support those SMEs with trade, which we've been hearing about. Ms. Turk, it's over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for the invitation to join you here today. Technological question first. You can see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Super. I see people nodding. And Rakesh, you've mentioned I've been diligently listening, but let me start by saying it's been really a super fascinating discussion for me. And I've learned a lot, and it's been very enriching to see what all the different agencies are doing. And I'm very happy that actually from the UNECE side, we've had partnerships with basically all three agencies that discussed beforehand. So I'm very pleased to also mention this, and I hope that we can in the future join hands again. Now, I guess what I will be trying to do here is, as we've just heard, zoom in a little bit into the trade perspective, but really also give you an overview of where we stand at UNECE with respect to standards for the SDGs and circular economy more specifically. And to preface, UNECE is one of the United Nations 5 regional economic commissions. And while we are called Economic Commission for Europe, the pan-European region we are servicing actually spans more than what you might intuitively connect with Europe at the first glance. Our 56 member states, they are from North America, Europe, EU and EFTA, when we talk about trade terms, Turkey, and then a series of countries which are ranging from Central Asia, Southern Caucasus, Western Balkan and Eastern Europe, and the Russian Federation. So if we talk about UNECE, that really spans from North America until Central Asia. And so this is a little bit of a background. And I myself, having been at UNCTAD before, for me, the development dimension is always very important. And I think in UNECE, one of our key objectives is really supporting and servicing these 17 countries that are countries with economies in transition. And on many occasions, also when we talk trade and when we talk standards, these countries and the economic actors in these countries, they face challenges frequently similar to what we see in the developing world. Now, what does UNECE do? We have our so-called functions or pillars of activities, and one of them is normative. We are actually an entity that is also developing and setting standards. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. But we are also a platform for exchange, for policy dialogue, and of course also providing technical assistance and support to our beneficiary countries. Now, UNECE as an organization has lots of different divisions, an energy division, an environmental division, a statistics division. So we look at standards from these different sort of substantive areas. And in the economic cooperation and trade division, which I am heading, we obviously also look at the trade-related standards, the trade facilitation-related standards, and we also look at the question of to what extent standards sort of like can create barriers to trade. And I guess the discussion you already had here today is when we heard that standards, they are a reality, they are a market reality, but we have really a lack of harmonization in terms of standards. And we've seen a proliferation of standards accompanied by a lack or an absence of harmonization. And I guess several of you have alluded to that before, that this can cause challenges for trade, for exports, and particularly so in developing countries, in transition economies, and for small-scale actors, for the SMEs and MSMEs who are striving to access international markets. So this connection between trade and standards, to which Ruby spoke so eloquently before also, that's something really at the core of our attention and concerns in UNECE. So what I'll do is I'll be giving you some examples of UNECE standards, and then zoom into either one or two sort of like activities in more detail, where it's really responding to also the discussion you had about greenwashing before. And I'll be delighted to show you how we are approaching that angle. Now, before I get into this, there was a second stream of thoughts that I felt came out quite clearly in the discussion before, namely the relevance of standards for the circular economy. And this is also an issue of great importance to UNECE. And here maybe to tell you that our membership in April, at the highest governing level of UNECE, at the so-called commission session, it was the 69th session of our commission, they identified circular economy and the sustainable use of natural resources as a priority topic. And subsequently, all the different work streams in UNECE, we are now looking with member states and with stakeholders to what extent our work streams can contribute to the circular economy transition. And in that regard, I've listened very closely, Pam, to what you had to say about circularity in standards, and Hans, what you had to say about the many different ISO standards, different entry points here. And also, Ruby, your contribution on circular economy, that's all very well noted. And I think that's a topic where we really need to even more join hands, and where the fact that UNECE has put this topic at the forefront at the highest level of policymaking for us, I think is also an opportunity to create real change and to feed the valuable work you are doing into UNECE processes. So much, I've used quite a bit of my time already. Let me see whether I managed to move through these slides now. Yes, indeed. I've mentioned at the beginning that UNECE itself, we are also a standard setting organization. And our standards cover a wide range of different areas, including, like, for example, energy efficiency in buildings and some of the topics I mentioned before. But let me give you 4 examples from our trade work. And the first set of examples, they relate to trade facilitation. And this is, I guess, an area for which UNECE is quite known, our e-business standards, our trade facilitation, the work that is being done in UNCFACT. These are, to a large extent, information exchange standards, where it's about sort of like defining a harmonious language, a similar approach to how information in trade-related processes is being shared. So when a product travels, for example, first on road, then on rail, then on an airplane or on a ship, it's important that the documents accompanying this trade in different modes of transport, that they are harmonized, that they look the same, that they have the same pieces of information. And this sort of like multimodal connectivity, semantic interoperability of these standards is one of the key areas of trade-related standardization work in UNECE. And we are at the moment working to kind of move all of that, or help countries move all of that from paper-based to electronic tool. So that's really the traditional trade facilitation standards work, standardization work we are doing. But that work has branched out into 2 areas that really have a lot to do with sustainability. That's our fisheries language for universal exchange, and our standards for information exchange on traceability, transparency of sustainable and circular value chains. So what are we doing there? The first one, the fisheries language for universal exchange, is still quite related to trade facilitation, because it's really about collecting data about what is happening in different ports. And the sustainability dimension is insofar as for ensuring a solid fisheries management of fish stock, you really need to have solid data about how much fish is being caught in which area and dispatched through which ports. So this is one initiative that we are also implementing together with the FAO, and which really can also help contribute combat illegal, unreported and unregulated fishery, a topic of great importance also in the World Trade Organization right now. Now, our second trade facilitation standard that really sort of takes up sustainability at the core is the standard for traceability and transparency of sustainable value chains in textiles and footwear. And what we are doing here is we are not looking so much about how a product travels, but we are looking at what is happening in the different stages of a supply chain. And we have started doing that in textiles and footwear. And as I understand, a great segment of our audience today is from the textile sector. So to make it more tangible here is, imagine that you're trying to buy a cotton t-shirt here in Geneva, and you wish to buy a sustainable cotton t-shirt, a t-shirt where the manufacturing hasn't involved human rights abuses, and where maybe the growing of the cotton hasn't used unnecessary water or depleted the Aral Sea in Central Asia. So as a consumer, you wish to know what has been the sustainability performance of the different steps of the value chains. And we've heard about all the many different voluntary and other sustainability standards that come into play here. Now at UNECE, we don't deal with the substance of these standards, but our information exchange standard helps trace what is happening along the value chain. So basically, what do companies in these very opaque and complex value chains in the textile sector, what do they need to record and document and confirm their conformity with at the different stages of this t-shirt, from the growing of the cotton to the spinning, the ginning, the sewing, until it is being sold in Geneva. And before we've talked a little bit about greenwashing. So the compliance with these standards along the value chain is a key aspect here, and being able to document what is happening along the supply chain is crucial, so that the sustainability claims can be sort of confirmed and that consumers can make informed choices. So UNECE comes in, that connecting point along the value chain, and our information exchange standard helps companies along the supply chain share the relevant information. And we are currently sort of like experimenting with blockchain, how to use advanced technologies for sharing that information more efficiently. So those were two trade-related, trade facilitation and sustainability-related examples of standards. But in UNECE, we do many more trade-related standards. We talk about public-private partnerships, an important tool for mobilizing financing for the SDGs. We have a standard on zero tolerance to corruption in public-private partnerships. We have a standard on PPPs in renewable energy, for example. Yeah? So very different type of standard, but also standard for the SDGs. And let me give you a third example, agricultural quality standards. It just so happens that this week, the meeting of our Working Party 7 on agricultural quality is taking place. And here we really look at the quality standards of different types of agricultural produce, more than 100 standards. And by ensuring sort of like that there are international, globally used standards, we also help facilitate trade in agricultural produce. Last but not least, Working Party 6, another abstract name, is the Working Party on Regulatory Cooperation and Standardization Policies. And here, what our membership does is really look at the processes of standard making. So it's less about really developing a trade facilitation standard or a PPP standard or an agricultural standard, but it's more at looking at the regulatory cooperation and the process of developing standards. And here we are really the platform to share information for governments, but also for other actors about how to develop standards, how to implement standards, how to ensure conformity assessments, how to kind of deal with questions related to metrology. Here we are not developing standards, but recommendations. For example, we have a recommendation on standards and regulations for sustainable development, or a recommendation on managing risk in regulatory frameworks. So that are some of the examples of what UNECE is doing in terms of standards and trade-related questions, as you mentioned before in the introduction. And I guess I will just briefly skim through some of the other slides, because I really think that the overview for me was quite important. Now, if you are interested in more our blockchain pilot, coming back to the textiles traceability work I've described, this is really, I would say, cutting edge, and important here to mention that, again, we are not developing the sustainability standard. We are developing the information exchange standard to document compliance with the sustainability standard. And here, the really interesting part now is the use of digital tools and of blockchain. And I'm very happy to say here that I understand that the TÜV has actually submitted a pledge in response to our call to action to see how you can be applying this. And I understand that your actions are really sort of like focusing at the moment on awareness raising, education, and collaboration initiatives to implement these textiles traceability tools. And I'd be delighted to kind of like continue that cooperation. I understand that you're also working with WWF, GIZ, and other brands in this regard. So here, a concrete, relevant application of this standard. You have all discussed a little bit standards for the SDGs. Just briefly, in UNECE, we are also mapping standards. I'm not going to go into detail. You have all described already different initiatives of mapping standards. We are quite interested in standards mapping for SDG 12, because as I mentioned, that's our SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. We are doing case studies, we are doing training courses, and doing research on standards for SDGs. And maybe one area that I would like to draw to your your attention, it has hardly been mentioned here today, is gender responsive standards. Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about environmental standards, circular economy standards, but we haven't yet touched on the topic of gender responsive standards. And I would say it's very important that standards in their different phases of development also look at the particularities for SDG 5. So that's an issue I would like to point out to you. And again, here, I'm very, very pleased to say that the two of the agencies with us here today, namely ISO and ECOS, have signed on to our Declaration on Gender Responsive Standards. So I very much look forward to carrying that forward in the implementation. I guess I will leave it with that to invite you to our Working Party 6, which will be meeting next week, actually. And in this Working Party 6, we will look at our different activities, sectoral initiatives, capacity building, best practices in our different areas of mandate, like regulatory cooperation, risk management, conformity assessment, metrology, and education. So I all invite you to join us for that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in UACE, our core new topic is now circular economy. So surely in Working Party 6 next week, we will look at how these different areas of work can contribute to a circular economy transition. So with this, I leave it. I thank you for your attention, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to join and to also listen to the extremely relevant work that has been presented by all the participating agencies. And at UNECE, we stand ready and are delighted to join hands in sort of like harnessing the power of standards and trade for sustainable development and for a circular economy transition. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Director Turk. Thank you for taking us through this journey, and also for this invitation to all participants to participate and contribute with the activities of Working Party 6 on regulatory cooperation. Now, having looked at standards, looking at the way it has been implemented, looking at all the activities that go on in the back, to have governments, policymakers align with each other. Many of us know that when implementing standards, it's also about a business case. Can that standard help us save money? Can that standard help reduce accidents? Can that standard make us more efficient or more attractive? These are questions that we are faced with every day when we are implementing standards. There's a very nice study by Accredia, which looked at implementation of these standards and then having them evaluated or certification based on these standards, so that there is a verified measure of the impact, the positive impact of implementation. And that is what somehow conformity assessment is. It's this vital link which is checking how the standards have been implemented and what's the ground reality. So there's of course a lot of standards also for conformity assessment. This is what companies like us involved in third-party testing, inspection, certification are involved at. We are validating implementation of standards, whether it be for energy efficiency, water efficiency, general material efficiency with regards to circular economy, or social labor aspects, biodiversity impact, air quality impact, and so on. So really what happens at a company level and in the supply chain. If we were to look at on a high level, we talk of economics, we talk of trade, we talk of investments into the area of SDGs or ESG or green finance. So let's say on the left-hand side is all the financial support we have. As this comes to companies would typically utilize that indicator, that signal from its stakeholders, come up with a strategy, which they would then digitize. Example with what we heard of upcoming developments on product traceability or blockchain implementation for exchanging data, and then implement all those decarbonization measures, whether it is about change to renewable energy or material efficiency or resource efficiency in general. But what we are talking now about is the legitimization of all of those efforts. And that legitimization happens often when companies are implementing standards. And in many cases, investors and third parties and stakeholders would want an independent verification about how that standard has been implemented. This is what companies of the TIC Council, so many such as to Rhineland, of course, Bureau Veritas, SGS, Intertech, and many others which are close to you are involved in these activities. So as we go towards the end and address your questions, Ryan, let's put up a poll to get a feeling from the audience, having heard about standard development, about the complexities and also the existence of these comprehensive standards and frameworks, and how policymakers are getting together to ease trade, how countries are coming up with voluntary standards. What would you do next after having heard all of this? Would you now go back and review what are the individual SDG targets for your state and region and then align somehow based on the standards referred there? Do you still feel that more information is required, that you would study the links that you have seen and that you will receive to come to grips with what should happen next? Would you go ahead and implement some of those standards for resource efficiency already to reduce cost? Would you persuade your local standardization bodies? We saw that about 60% of you are already or have been involved in standards development. Would you become more active via your local bodies to influence somehow standards development and bring your perspective in there? Would you pass on the message of how standards can support with the SDG targets and sustainability target with at least 5 people? And would you, let's say, request the standardization bodies to prepare a clear, a holistic mapping of these technical standards to SDGs and ESG indicators so that it becomes easier and, let's say, more clear for all of you? So it will be useful to have your feedback. If you can select the top 3 activities that you would get involved with. Yeah. And then let's pull up the results on the screen, Ryan. Okay, so we see about half of you have mentioned that you would go ahead and review further the SDG targets on a country level and see what are the standards mentioned there. Some of you mentioned that you would start implementing these standards. We see also about 46% of you would actively participate more in standards development. And 46% of you mentioned that you would want more clarity and a mapping. So I would request our panelists to reflect upon this feedback. So maybe we start with ladies like normal. Ms. Turk, since you were the most patient of all of us, perhaps would you like to reflect on what you see here in the poll results?
Okay, I had the little results above my microphone. So I would say the good part here is that it seems that confusion has been reduced. Yeah, if we look at our audience, so I guess we have achieved something in our discussion by sharing information, clarifying things, maybe also allowing people to find additional sources of information and sort of like finding their own way to go forward. So I also think it's very positive that you have high numbers, more than 50% on reviewing and understanding the SDG targets, so really integrating the SDGs in the standards, and on the implementation side. So I would think that this maybe puts us on the path for further action for achieving concrete impact with the type of discussions we are having in these webinars. And I look forward to also hearing more about what participants will have done subsequently. Thank you.
Right, thanks. And how about you, Ruby? Is there something that when you look at these results that you would want to find something interesting or something that's unexpected?
I mean, I don't come from the standards development per se. So I found that the first point that's been highlighted, reviewing and understanding SDG targets of my state, region, and aligning with reference standards. I think this is something that is very pertinent. And of course, there are many standards today that have been mapping against the SDG targets. But then again, you know, I just wanted to point out that the SDGs, the targets seem to be very policy maker, and it doesn't really speak to consumers as much if you look at each of the SDG targets. So I think it's interesting to find a way that it actually also speaks to consumers as well. That would be what I would, I mean, very quickly when reviewing this results thing.
Right. Thank you. And Pamela?
Thank you, Rakesh. And what a great poll that was. And I think the 3 takeaways, the highlights for me were that if we all walk away from this discussion intending to research this subject more and clarify in our minds what the questions, what the challenges are, where we need to do more work, then I think that's a success for this session. I think mapping, understanding what are the standards, where do we apply them, would be extremely helpful. So clarity on the mapping and what we can use, where and when. And then I think the final point for me was this determination perhaps for greater engagement in standardization, because clearly all of us who are tuning in today have perspectives, have an understanding of the subject areas. And if we can bring those to the table, we will end up with better quality standards that will have an impact on our environment. So congratulations, good survey.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Hans Schroeder, what is your feeling? What's the message you will take back to ISO and your peers in there?
Yes, well, I agree with what Ruby said and Pamela said, and I want to add that, for example, the last score, request industry standardization bodies to prepare clear and holistic mapping. I would like to add the government to that line, because what I've noticed is there's a lot of, how do you say that, misunderstanding also between governments and ISO standards. They think, oh, ISO standards are not applicable for government institutions, they're only applicable for business companies, but that's not true. And so the collaboration between business industry and governments is really something which can be improved a lot and which can help also inform consumers, like what Ruby was saying, like inform consumers even more better, and also the small and medium enterprises, which is also very difficult for them. So yes.
Yeah. Right, thank you. Then I want to say once again, thank you very much for the time that you have spent in preparation for today's event. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you very much for sharing all the experience of many of your colleagues. And to the audience, thank you for being here. Thank you for participating, and thank you for being part of this extended celebration of World Standard Day. Please take care, and we'll be in touch. Bye.